Welcome to the 2024 Twin Cities Film Fest presented by Stearns Bank. I'm your host, Lori Ruvers, and I have the pleasure of being on the red carpet today for the premiere of Wild Hope Mission Impossible. I have with me the subject of the film, Pat Brown. Pat Brown is an internationally renowned scientist who just makes the world a better place with solutions. And one of those solutions is a plant-based food item that you might have heard of, the Impossible Burger. Pat, thank you so much for being here.
Sure, happy to be here.
What led you to create the Impossible Burger?
About 15 years ago, I started trying to learn more about what are the big environmental issues in the world. Relatively quickly, I realized that the overwhelming driver of a catastrophic collapse of biodiversity and the most destructive technology on Earth was the use of animals to produce food. And nobody was seriously trying to address the question, and I felt as a biochemist there's no reason why there isn't a better technology than cows for turning plants into meat and dairy foods and so forth. In fact, we ought to be able to make them more delicious, healthier, more sustainable, more affordable, and so forth. But just people it never occurred to people that, why are we still using cows to make this stuff? So I decided to take the problem on, and because the solution had to be market-based. The only way that we replace that technology is by giving consumers something better, making it available to them, and so forth. So that's why it's a company as opposed to a lab project at Stanford, and that's what's behind it.
And why is eating a plant-based diet important for our planet?
Well, as I said, the use of animals is a food technology. By which I mean animal agriculture and the global fishing industry, are overwhelmingly responsible for a catastrophic collapse of global biodiversity. One example of which is that the average populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish species worldwide have been tracked for about 5 decades. And today they're less than a third what they were 50 years ago. So that is an absolutely catastrophic collapse, and it's probably the first domino in a broader collapse of the natural ecosystems that keep our planet viable. It doesn't get nearly enough attention, but the thing that keeps that industry alive is the continuing demand for their products. And so anytime someone chooses to replace an animal product in their diet with plant-based product of any kind, there's a huge savings in terms of the impact on nature. The other thing is that actually, if we could phase out animal agriculture globally, and I published a paper about this a couple of years ago, the negative emissions, meaning the greenhouse gas removed from the atmosphere, would be sufficient to offset all predicted greenhouse gas emissions for a period of about 40 years, creating a sustained period of net zero emissions, and offset about 2/3 of all emissions through the end of the century. So a huge opportunity to put the brakes on climate change and actually turn back the clock on climate change by the simple act of basically replacing animals as a food source. So every time you make that choice, even if you do it once, you're contributing.
And what is the Carbon Ranch? And can you tell us about what you are doing on the Carbon Ranch today?
Yeah, so the Carbon Ranch is intended as sort of a demonstration project and an experiment. And what's behind it is that in order to realize the benefits of reducing or eliminating our dependence on animals in the food system, we need to engage farmers and ranchers as our allies in restoring native ecosystems on the land that is currently occupied by that industry, and particularly cattle grazing. And it turns out that there are very credible ways by which they could improve their livelihoods by transitioning from raising cattle to restoring ecosystems. And I could go into the details of that, but the Carbon Ranch is intended to be an experiment to figure out what's the best way to do this, because it turns out no one has ever looked. No one's ever done the experiment to figure out what's the best way to turn degraded land that's been used for cattle grazing back into a healthy native ecosystem. We literally don't know how to do it. And so I decided to do the experiment, and I got some funding from the Impossible Foundation, bought a ranch in Arkansas, and 2 years ago I started doing that experiment. And it's so far it's going great.
Great. What are you working on now, and what are you excited about next?
Well, I'm working on a lot of things. I'm trying to, one thing I'm trying to do is to continue through various vehicles, communication. I wrote an op-ed for The Guardian to try to get the word out, and this is why I'm here with you, is to just try to get people informed about this. I'm also starting up some work at Stanford that's actually intended to build a supply chain of plant-based ingredients for plant-based meat, fish, and dairy foods, new kinds of plant-based ingredients, and particularly proteins isolated from leaves, which is a kind of a surprising source, but most of the protein on Earth is in leaves. Most of the protein in the diet of most animals on Earth comes from leaves. And it's a hugely promising source from an environmental and food security standpoint. So anyway, that's one project. And the other project is expanding the Cattle Ranch project to other climates and geographies. So actually just last week I was in Madagascar, which is one of the most threatened places in the world in terms of nature and biodiversity, meeting with a scientist there to design a forest restoration project on land degraded by cattle grazing. So, yeah, continuing on the same mission, basically.
Thank you so much. We are so excited to go in and watch Wild Hope, Mission Impossible. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your service, really.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in.